but Gabriel Doroshin, our favorite heir to the throne of Imperial Russia, has been very outspoken about what he thinks about what should happen in Russia itself. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there was an amazing interview, of course. Like, we've mentioned Gabriel Doroshin before in some of our Telegram and Twitter posts, and I even spoke about him on the podcast. But essentially, he's 7 or 8 generations removed great grandson of Emperor Nicholas I. So this is Emperor Nicholas I, who reigned from 1825 until 1855, and who passed away during the Crimean War. So essentially, a descendant of the Romanov dynasty directly through his mother's line. And Gabriel grew up in France. Actually, he's 26 or 27 years old now, and he grew up in France in the sort of Russian Orthodox Rocourt community there in Paris. And he's actually a local Parisian, in fact. So he grew up speaking bilingually both French and Russian. His Russian is quite good considering he never lived in Russia itself. But in when he turned 18, actually, his 18th birthday coincided with the beginning of the Donbass War. So in 2014, he traveled to the Donbass, and he actually fought as a volunteer between 2014 and 2017. After that, of course, after the Minsk Accords kind of settled things down, so to speak, and some of the Russian commanders disappeared, and the conflict really became kind of flat and stale, he traveled back to France only because he found it very difficult in the Donetsk region to actually make a living. So he traveled back to France, and at the beginning of the SMO, Gabriel returned back to Donetsk, Lugansk, reconnected with some of his old comrades, and has served on the front lines for a year and a half now continuously, which is very admirable for somebody from a pretty, not even an affluent family. In fact, in the interview, he does mention the fact that his family, he had no other familial connections to the Romanovs in terms of like he was never invited to any of the banquets, and the official Romanov House representatives, they've openly stated that they do not recognize him as heir to the throne. But funny enough, so he's extremely, let's just cut to the chase here. Gabriel is extremely based because, of course, the interview was 3 hours long, and it was recorded, I believe, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, but it definitely took them a while to release it. And in the interview, he speaks about the fact that, well, Strelkov should be free, Ukraine doesn't exist, it's not a historical entity. He says that, like, it just cuts to the chase of a lot of these massive subjects, and they ask him all kinds of really, you could say, on-point questions. For example, well, would you make abortion illegal? He's like, absolutely, abortion should be completely illegal. It is, the murder of children, and there should be education around it too, especially women should understand, women and men and things like that. He says, well, and they're like, well, what do we do? Do we increase contraception? He's like, no, just premarital sex should just not take place. Like, so he made like open, very Christian statements, which you could hear a local priest say, and this young man who is has gone to church his entire life. He's an example of an actual proper cradle-dox Orthodox Western Christian who has actually stayed on the right path for a long time. Now is actively participating in the conflict, supporting his people over there in Donetsk. And in fact, some of the other subjects he spoke about, well, they asked him historical questions like, well, what's your opinion of like Nicholas II? He says, well, he's a pious Tsar and he's a martyr. And then he mentions, funny enough, because Nicholas II is canonized in the main Russian church as a confessor, not as a martyr. And he mentions that no, he is a martyr because Nicholas II was martyred by Freemasons and them boys. And he says, well, them boys ritually killed him, our former Tsar, and he says because of that, he shouldn't be classified as a confessor because confessorship kind of denotes the fact that you were killed by your own people, but he wasn't killed by his own people. He was suffering mainly under the influence of Freemasons and those particular people, that I've mentioned prior. So very interesting. This is Gabriel Doroshin's direct words, paraphrasing, and that transitions to just the fact that he started speaking about this particular subject. He says that, well, they said, look, the interviewer said, well, look, we don't really support any of these strong and discriminatory statements. He's like, no, that's okay. You just need to understand the fact that these people rejected God a long time ago. You can read about it in the Bible. And they said, the blood is on us and on our people. His blood, speaking about the Messiah. And yeah, so he went really into detail on all of that. And funny thing, of course, him being the descendant of the Romanovs, Conrad, the subject came up. It's like, well, do you look forward to the restoration of the monarchy? And he says, look, I don't have any legal claim to the throne whatsoever because, frankly, 8 generations removed, it's on my mother's side. Legally speaking, I'm not a descendant. But he says, look, if the Russian people call upon me to be a Tsar, I'll accept it. So it's kind of like this very epic, to the point, almost like in a... Which is what we've been missing for a very long time. We're missing directness, and he just says, "Look, he's like, I don't believe it's Christian of me to fight for power or to fight for influence or anything. But if the Russian people do need a leader to lead them, I'll take that upon myself. And if the Russian people, if God selects me to rule, And if the Russian people come to me with this proposal, similar to how they, ancient times came to Rurik, came to Fyodor Ivanovich, came to all these rulers alongside the bishop and just said, look, God has chosen you to rule as the Tsar, similar to how the people of ancient Israel, and he makes this connection where, of course, it's very biblical, and it's funny that he knows all these details, because in the Bible, of course, when King Saul passes, dies in war, the people of Judea and Israel, of course, come to King David in order to proclaim him king. And in a similar way, in Russian history, the people of Russia, alongside their bishops, would approach the next heir to the throne and ask him, the next heir, to rule over them as the Tsar. And so he says that, well, look, that's potential if you guys ever want to do that. But in fact, he does have some critical statements about Russia too. So he mentions, well, because the interview is 3 hours long, so Gabriel goes into details about, well, him living in Donetsk and Lugansk at the moment, he says the big issue is nutrition. So he says, look, the food in Russia, he says, is like not as good as what we have in France. So he says Russian nutritional standards should be. He went into on this tangent for about 10 minutes, speaking about like how Russians should be eating more protein and stuff like that. It was and should be eating less chemicals, because a lot of their food, of course, is produced on like cheap factories with a lot of chemical produce and things that preserve food for a long time. In Russia, he says that's a major issue. I was like, okay, that's kind of a niche subject, my man. And then he, of course, went into details about how, well, he believes the SMO there's definitely been some hiccups. And he mentioned the fact that, Yevgeny Prigozhin's death has definitely been, because he specifically fought under Bakhmut and Solidar. So that was his particular deployment over the last, I guess you can say, 12 months' time. So he was particularly assisting Wagner very much on the ground. So it was quite an interesting interview. Generally speaking, there are no negative sides to this young man. I mean, yes, he has grown up in France in the West, but similar to, even Bishop Savo of Zelenograd, for example, he's an immigrant too. He immigrated to Russia when he was a teenager, and now he's one of the leading bishops of Moscow, you can say. So there is this, big reunion of Russians actually born overseas who then later end up traveling through Russia and serving in some capacity. I think it's very admirable. And whether or not this discussion does lay down some sort of path of monarchy, I think it's still curious that, God does grant us these, I guess, really cool and affluent examples of young Christian laymen who, are willing to serve in the front lines, who we can somewhat follow, maybe, like a future position of leadership. And the fact that he's, well-spoken, handsome, likable guy, it's a bit rare these days, I would say, because most of these people either end up dead or end up ostracized, or maybe, pushed to the side somewhat. So I think it was a wonderful interview. Unfortunately, not released in the English language yet. Maybe eventually they'll either dub it or add subtitles. And this, of course, big shout out to Obыкновенный Tsarism, which translates to Ordinary Tsarism. That is their YouTube channel. It's quite a big YouTube channel. It's just been kind of, it was created during the SMO, and they have really great interviews, especially for Russian audiences, and interviewing Gabriel Doroshin. Yeah, definitely a highlight of the week.
Oh, I'm hoping as a low IQ non-polyglot, I'm hoping it can be subtitled or something. But Doroshin is such an interesting character to me, not just because, we are nationalist, czarist, orthodox people on this show, but the fact that he fought in the Donbass, the fact that he comes from France, it's this kind of emergence of this. You don't just need a good leader, you need the emergence of a new national myth, like new stories to reinvigorate the population, to inspire them, new heroes to name their children after, and these sorts of things. And Doroshin, not only, is his story amazing as a warrior, but he also, the story of how he met his wife, he met her when he came over to the Donbass in a small village, like in the zone where there was fighting happening, and he brings her back to France, but then they both move back to Russia. And so if this guy becomes the Tsar, it's kind of like a reverse situation with Tsar Nicholas and Empress Alexandra. The Donbass, the heartland wife, brings, in theory, he ends up coming from the West, just like Empress Alexandra came from, Germany, the UK. He comes from France. She unites him to the Russian people. She helped him get better at his Russian and everything like that. And, now they have children together. So there's also, in theory, no crisis of legitimacy. We've proven that he can have children. So it's a very interesting character. In Russia, it's hard with, especially people that were born, if anything, it may have helped that he was born outside of Russia, because people, his age and older, born during the Soviet era, have a lot of baggage that very much clashes with the emerging Orthodox ethos of Russian civilization right now. So pray for Gabriel Doroshin, pray for Holy Russia. We are here on the show, and it's a very encouraging thing.